The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as King Charles III sat in his private study, staring at the ornate family photographs that lined his mahogany desk. Among them, a recent picture of Camilla surrounded by her children and grandchildren caught his attention. Their smiling faces seemed to mock the decision he had been contemplating for weeks. Charles had always prided himself on being a modern monarch, someone who understood the delicate balance between tradition and progress. But as he held the latest security briefing in his hands, his resolve hardened. The report detailed concerning behavior from several members of Camilla's extended family that threatened to embarrass the crown. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had been photographed at exclusive London clubs, making remarks about royal finances that were overheard by gossip columnists. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, had been increasingly vocal on social media about her opinions on royal protocols, often contradicting official palace positions. Even more troubling were the reports about some of Camilla's grandchildren, who had been caught selling stories about private family gatherings to tabloid journalists. The king rubbed his temples as he remembered the conversation he had with his private secretary just days earlier. "Your Majesty," the man had said carefully, "the public relations team is finding it increasingly difficult to manage the narrative when members of the Queen Consort's family continue to act independently of palace guidance." Charles knew what needed to be done, but the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. This was not just about protocol or public image. This was about his wife, the woman he had fought decades to marry, the woman who had stood by him through the darkest periods of his life. He walked to the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds, watching as gardeners tended to the roses that Camilla loved so dearly. She had transformed not just his personal life but also brought warmth to the cold corridors of royal duty. Her laugh echoed through rooms that had known too much formality. Her genuine care for people had softened his sometimes rigid approach to royal responsibilities. But being king meant making impossible choices. Charles had learned this lesson the hard way throughout his life. He remembered his grandmother's words about duty coming before personal happiness, words that had guided and haunted him in equal measure. The decision crystallized in his mind as he recalled a recent incident that had been kept from the public. During a private dinner at Clarence House, one of Camilla's relatives had openly discussed confidential family matters with guests who had no business knowing such information. The breach of trust was unforgivable, but more importantly, it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what royal life required. Charles returned to his desk and picked up his fountain pen, the same one his mother had given him years ago. He began drafting a memorandum that would reshape the dynamics of his marriage and send shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. The document was formal yet devastating in its implications. Effective immediately, members of Camilla's family would no longer be included in official royal functions. They would not receive invitations to state dinners, ceremonial events, or private royal gatherings. Their access to royal residences would be restricted, and any future public statements would need prior approval from the palace communications team. As he wrote, Charles thought about the woman sleeping peacefully in their shared quarters, unaware that her husband was about to draw a line that would separate her from the people she held most dear. Camilla had always been the bridge between his royal world and normal family life. She brought stories of her children's achievements, shared photos of her grandchildren's school plays, and insisted on maintaining the warm, chaotic dynamics of a regular family within the structured environment of royal life. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years fighting for the right to marry Camilla against fierce opposition from the establishment, the public, and even his own mother. Now, he was the one imposing restrictions that would hurt her deeply. Charles sealed the memorandum in an official envelope and summoned his private secretary. The man appeared within minutes, his face grave as he recognized the formal nature of the document being handed to him. "This goes into effect immediately," Charles said quietly. "All department heads are to be notified by end of day. No exceptions, no delays." His private secretary nodded solemnly, understanding the magnitude of what was being requested. "Very good, Your Majesty." "And the Queen Consort?" Charles paused, his hand still resting on the desk where Camilla's photograph smiled back at him. "I will inform Her Majesty personally." As the door closed behind his secretary, Charles slumped into his chair. The decision was made. But the hardest part lay ahead. He would have to look into the eyes of the woman he loved and explain why her family was no longer welcome in their world. The afternoon sun began to filter through the study windows as Charles prepared himself for a conversation that would change everything. He knew Camilla well enough to predict her reaction. She would be hurt, confused, and ultimately forced to choose between supporting his decision and defending her family. But what Charles did not anticipate was the depth of silence that would follow his announcement, a silence so profound and lasting that it would shake the very foundations of the palace and challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the price of wearing the crown. Camilla was arranging white roses in a crystal vase when Charles entered their private sitting room at Clarence's house. The late afternoon light cast golden shadows across the comfortable space they had created together. Filled with personal photographs, well-worn books, and the kind of lived-in warmth that made this room their sanctuary from royal formality, she looked up with her characteristic smile, the one that had first captivated him decades ago. "Darling, you look terribly serious. Has Parliament done something dreadful again?" Charles stood in the doorway, still holding the copy of the memorandum that would change their lives. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times throughout the day, but facing her now, all his carefully chosen words seemed inadequate. "Camilla, we need to discuss something important," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately caught her attention. She set down the roses and turned to face him fully, her intuition already sensing that whatever was coming would not be pleasant. They had been married long enough for her to recognize the subtle signs of his distress. Charles sat beside her on the floral sofa, the same spot where they had shared countless private moments away from the scrutiny of the world. He handed her the document without preamble, watching as her eyes scanned the formal language that would ban her family from royal life. The silence that followed was unlike anything Charles had experienced. It was not the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other perfectly. This was something else entirely, a void that seemed to expand with each passing second. Camilla read the memorandum twice, her face betraying nothing of the storm that was surely raging inside her. When she finally looked up, her blue eyes held an expression Charles had never seen before. It was not anger or hurt, though both were certainly present. It was something closer to profound disappointment, mixed with a kind of quiet devastation. "I see," she said simply, her voice steady but distant. Charles reached for her hand, but she pulled it away gently, not unkindly, but with a finality that spoke volumes. "Camilla, please let me explain," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No explanation necessary, Charles. You are the king, and this is your decision." Her tone was perfectly polite, perfectly controlled, and perfectly devastating in its formality. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where they had hosted so many family gatherings. Charles could see her shoulders tense as she processed the full implications of his decision. "Tom and Laura will need to be informed," she said without turning around. "And the grandchildren. They will want to know why they are no longer welcome at Christmas dinner or Easter celebrations." "It does not have to affect private family time," Charles said desperately. "This is about official functions, public appearances." Camilla turned then, and her expression stopped him mid-sentence. "Charles, you have just told me that my children and grandchildren are an embarrassment to the crown. Do you honestly believe that we can simply pretend this decision exists only within palace walls?" The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had been so focused on protecting the monarchy that he had failed to consider how impossible it would be to maintain normal family relationships under such circumstances. "They put us in an impossible position," he said weakly. "The press attention, the unauthorized comments, the breaches of privacy. They are human beings, Charles, flawed, sometimes foolish human beings, who never asked to be thrust into this world of impossible expectations and constant scrutiny." Her voice remained level, but he could hear the pain underneath. Camilla moved to her desk and pulled out a sheet of her personal stationery. Charles watched in growing alarm as she began to write. "What are you doing?" "Writing to Tom and Laura. They deserve to hear this from me, not read about it in tomorrow's newspapers when some palace insider decides to leak your memorandum." Charles felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. "Camilla, please. We can discuss this. Find a middle ground." She paused in her writing and looked at him with something that might have been pity. There is no middle ground when it comes to family, Charles. You either accept people as they are, with all their faults and complications, or you do not. You have made your choice. The next few hours passed in a blur of strained politeness and careful distance. Camilla made the necessary phone calls to her children, her voice remaining steady as she explained the new reality. Charles could hear only her side of the conversations, but the long silences told him everything he needed to know about how the news was being received. By evening, the palace staff had begun to notice the change. Camilla moved through her scheduled activities with her usual professionalism, but the warmth that typically characterized her interactions with staff and visitors was notably absent. She smiled when appropriate, made pleasant conversation when required, but there was a guardedness that had not been there before. Charles tried multiple times throughout the evening to engage her in meaningful conversation, but each attempt was met with polite responses that revealed nothing of her true feelings. She was not angry in any way that he could address or argue against. Instead, she had simply retreated behind the same kind of protective formality that he had spent years teaching her to navigate. The most devastating moment came during their nightly routine. For years, they had ended each day sitting together in their private sitting room, sharing stories about their day, discussing upcoming events, or simply enjoying comfortable silence. That evening, Camilla excused herself early, claiming fatigue. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said as she headed toward the stairs. The formal address hit Charles like a slap. In private, she had always called him Charles or Darling, never using his title except in jest. Now, the carefully chosen words created a distance between them that felt insurmountable. Charles sat alone in their sitting room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of the life they had built together. The white roses Camilla had arranged earlier seemed to mock him with their perfect beauty, a reminder of the domestic happiness he had just sacrificed for the sake of royal protocol. As the hours passed and the palace settled into nighttime quiet, Charles began to understand the true cost of his decision. He had not just banned Camilla's family from royal functions. He had fundamentally altered the nature of his relationship with his wife, creating a breach that might never fully heal. The silence that had begun in their sitting room was spreading through the palace like a contagion, affecting every interaction, every moment of what should have been private happiness. And Charles was beginning to realize that some decisions, once made, could never be undone. 3 weeks had passed since Charles issued his memorandum, and the palace had become a place of whispered conversations and careful glances. The staff, with their finely tuned ability to read the emotional temperature of the royal household, moved through their duties with unusual caution. Everyone could feel the change, though few understood its source. Camilla continued to fulfill her royal obligations with the same dedication she had always shown. She attended charity events, met with dignitaries, and smiled for photographers, but those who knew her well could see the difference. The spontaneous laughter that had become her trademark was notably absent. Her interactions, while perfectly appropriate, lacked the genuine warmth that had made her so beloved by the public and palace staff alike. Charles found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. Every morning, he woke hoping that the previous day's coolness had been temporary, that somehow they could find their way back to the easy companionship that had sustained them through decades of public scrutiny and private challenges. But each day brought only more of the same polite distance that was slowly driving him to distraction. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine evening. Charles had spent the day in meetings with government ministers, dealing with the kind of constitutional matters that required his careful attention. He returned to their private quarters hoping for the kind of debriefing conversation that had always helped him process the complexities of his role. Camilla was reading in her favorite chair by the fireplace, glasses perched on her nose as she focused on a novel. The scene was so familiar, so reminiscent of countless peaceful evenings, that Charles felt a surge of hope. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into his own chair across from her. "Quite productive, thank you," she replied without looking up from her book. The literacy program visit went well, and the hospital board meeting was informative. Her response was perfectly polite and completely devoid of the personal details she would have shared in the past. She did not ask about his day, did not comment on the political situation he had been managing, did not offer any of the insights that had made her such a valuable confidant. Charles tried again. I was thinking we might take a weekend at Highgrove. The gardens are particularly beautiful this time of year. If your Majesty believes that would fit with the royal schedule, I am certainly available, she said, turning a page of her book. The formal response was like a knife to his heart. Highgrove had always been their sanctuary, the place where they could be most themselves, away from protocol and public expectations. Her willingness to treat even that sacred space as merely another royal obligation showed him how deeply his decision had wounded her. "Camilla, please," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Can we not go back to how we were?" She finally looked up from her book, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the woman he had married. But it was quickly replaced by something harder, more resolved. "How we were," she repeated quietly. "Charles, how we were was built on the understanding that marriage meant creating a new family together. That my children would be your stepchildren, that my grandchildren would have a grandfather figure in their lives, that we would navigate this strange royal world as a united front." She closed her book and set it aside, giving him her full attention for the first time in weeks. "You have made it clear that my family was always conditional, always subject to your approval and the needs of the monarchy. That is your right as king, but it changes everything about who we are to each other." Charles leaned forward, desperate to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with every word. It was not about approval. It was about protecting the institution, protecting what we have built together. What we built together included them, Charles. Every Christmas morning, every birthday celebration, every small moment of ordinary family life that made this extraordinary existence bearable. You did not just exclude them from royal functions. You excluded them from us. The truth of her words settled over him like a weight. In his determination to protect the monarchy, he had destroyed the very thing that had made his reign meaningful. The family life he had fought so hard to achieve was crumbling under the pressure of the same royal protocol he had tried to modernize. "Tell me what to do," he said simply. "Tell me how to fix this." Camilla was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice was filled with a sadness that broke his heart. "I do not know if it can be fixed, Charles. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. My children now know that their place in our lives was never secure, that their acceptance was always temporary. How do I explain to my grandchildren why Granddad Charles no longer wants them at Christmas dinner?" The image of Camilla's young grandchildren, who had always run to greet him with such joy at family gatherings, hit him with unexpected force. In his focus on abstract concepts like duty and protocol, he had forgotten the real faces and relationships that would be affected by his decision. "What if I reverse the memorandum?" he asked desperately. "And then what happens the next time someone in my family makes a mistake? The next time Tom says something inappropriate or Laura posts something you disagree with? Do we go through this again? Do they live in constant fear of the next royal edict that could exile them from our lives?" Charles had no answer because they both knew she was right. The damage was not just in the immediate decision, but in the precedent it set, the message it sent about the conditional nature of their place in the royal family. The days that followed their conversation were marked by a different kind of silence. Where before there had been polite distance, now there was simply emptiness. Camilla went through the motions of royal life with mechanical precision, but the joy that had characterized her approach to her role was gone. Charles found himself spending more and more time alone in his study, staring at the same family photographs that had started this entire crisis. He realized with growing despair that in his effort to protect the monarchy from embarrassment, he had created a scandal far more damaging than anything Camilla's family could have caused. The palace staff, with their keen awareness of royal dynamics, began to whisper about the change in atmosphere. Veteran courtiers who had served the royal family for decades spoke quietly among themselves about the profound shift in the relationship between the king and queen consort. But perhaps the most telling indicator of how deeply the crisis had affected the royal household came from an unexpected source. One morning, Charles discovered that Camilla had quietly moved some of her personal belongings to a guest suite in another wing of the palace. She had not announced her intention to live separately, had not made any dramatic gestures or demands. She had simply, quietly, created physical distance that matched the emotional gulf that had grown between them. When Charles confronted her about the move, her response was characteristically direct. "I thought it might be easier this way," she said simply. "For both of us." As Charles stood in their shared sitting room, now noticeably emptied of her personal touches, he understood that his decision had cost him more than he could have imagined. The silence that had begun with his rejection of her family had grown into something that threatened to consume everything they had built together. The King of England, surrounded by all the trappings of power and privilege, had never felt more alone. And the woman who had been his anchor through decades of public scrutiny and personal struggle was slipping away from him, one silent day at a time.